the area. And also we have 7, maybe 8 students here, which is another really innovation compared to last year, because in the past we maybe had 1 student if we're lucky. Now they have 7 students, so next year we need to double that, they're 14. It's also because of our sponsors. They help us to sponsor students, and particularly multi-choice. They have come to the party big time with the gold sponsorship. And then, of course, all the other sponsors, either with financial or with some interesting giveaways that you can win by the end of today. Now, we are in Gauteng, and we are in the environments of the city of Johannesburg. So therefore, I have to go through some safety announcements. And one of the safety announcements is important because the ladies and the gentlemen is around the corner, and because that door is open, where they're busy with the satellite station, it's just behind the door is the facilities. If in the unlikely event of a fire, then we assemble in the far end of the car park. And because we are less than 100, we don't have a paramedic, so please don't get ill. So, well, maybe 1 or 2 people here belong to Hemnet. Maybe they're trained. CPR, stuff like that, I don't know. But it's nice to have another AMSAT SA conference. And, you know, we had to change venue because the Innovation Hub became so expensive, they just lost it. So we had to scout around, and we went to different hotels, and the one that gave us the best deal was a wedding venue. But then we figured out, you know what a wedding venue looks like? It's a concrete wall and a concrete floor. Because when you arrange a wedding, you pay minimum for that space, but you pay megabucks to put all the stuff on the walls and all the kind of drapings they do. So in the end, when we went to have a look, the acoustics were so good that you could hear yourself 5 times. So we started our search again, and then I remember I attended some conferences here last year, and I took my chances and started negotiating to the management, and that came sort of met halfway. And then because of our sponsorships, we managed to keep that price at a reasonable level. But those days that we can have this at 100 and 150 or even 200 rand, they're no longer with us. And so we were concerned, well, would radio amateurs really go and put money into attending a thing like this when they have to pay 400 rand? A long debate about that. So we thought, well, the only way is to try it, because if you think about it, if you go out for a couple of drinks and a snack, it costs you more than that today. So, you know, everything is all relative. So I'm very pleased with the support today. Just want to make sure that everybody's got a seat, because there's a few of you that came that hadn't booked before, and I did last night tell the hotel, look, we need a bit of space, so I'd rather put in a few extra seats, but I just hope there's enough. You know, there's still an empty one there, and there's mine, okay? So that's a story, but we also had a number of people that recently joined AMSAT SA, and I thought it would be an opportunity to present them with their certificates rather than emailing them. Now, they're not in any particular order, so I can't be accused of taking one first and one last, because they just, as I printed them. Pint Airport, ZS1XX. Welcome to AMSAT SA. I think you are second female member. Welcome. What we'll do is at lunchtime we'll get all those of you together and we'll take some pictures. Derek Moore, I'm sure he's been a member on and off for years, but he recently joined again. And he is from Namibia, as a call sign of Victor 51 Delta Mike and ZS1 ACR. I don't want to give you some glasses. Welcome. Una Carlson, ZS1 UNA. Welcome.
Thank you.
Maybe our youngest member, Glenn Bailey, 06 Golf. Gee, what a fancy call sign, eh? 06 Golf. Well done. And then Shane Bailey. Don't know how they work together like that. Thanks. And then Jacob. Now these are members that have joined in the last 2 weeks or so. If you had joined before, you would have had your certificate in the mail, so thank you. Right, so that's that formality gone. If you look at the program, starting with the keynote speaker. After that, session 1, Ray Weber takes over as the chairman of that session, and we can talk about some interesting things there. And then Brian Jacobs takes over later, and then I don't know him. I don't think you know him. He's totally Nico van Rensburg. He will take over there. And then we come to the draw for the prizes, and there's one prize that's not on your list, and it's a picoscope, which is quite a valuable prize. You won't be able to get the actual unit, but you're going to get the voucher for it today. And then you can organize with the people exhibiting their how to, if you're the lucky winner, but you have to be here. So it's no good if you're bailing out early, then you're not part of the draw. Right, so let's get the conference on the way. I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker. I think he's a guy I've known for many, many years, and if I can find his CV or his summary of the CV. Lyndon has over 30 years experience in spectrum management and regulatory affairs. He's currently the Chief Director Radio and Satellite Communication at the Department of Post and Telecommunications and Postal Services. I guess soon you're going to be maybe still working for TOC, because I believe that that's very imminent now. Back to the old days of Department of Communication. He is responsible for the implementation of national space policy and the regulation of space affairs in South Africa, as well as ensuring that these activities are carried out in compliance with the provisions of the international treaties and to South Africa as a party of that. He's been a member of the South African delegation to the ITU World Radio Communications Conference since 1995 and was the South African National Rapporteur for Satellite Issues for WRC 15. He is once again the South African National Rapporteur for Satellite Issues at WRC 19. Lyndon has been responsible for the development of a paper on a simplified regulatory regime for non-GSO satellites with short duration missions within the ITU Working Party 4A. This paper will be considered at the ITU World Radio Conference in December 2019. Now, there's a little background about that. Right now, all the universities that produce CubeSats actually get, in most countries, amateur radio frequencies allocated. The ITU has been becoming quite, I can say they start objecting it quite vehemently, because, you know, after all, they're amateur radio frequencies, and they should really be allocated frequencies in the kind of spectrum in which those particular satellites operate. So at the moment, they will coordinate the frequencies for those satellites as long as some amateur radio involvement or a radio amateur involved. But there are many now where there's no radio amateurs involved, where they purely buy the satellite off the shelf or the kit, put it together and put in one or two of the experiments. This thing gets launched. Once it's launched, they download a bit of telemetry, get a bit of the data, and that's the end. They write their paper, and that's the end of the satellite, and that's actually put to no further use. Now it's all right when these things are launched from the space shuttle, because then they last maybe 3 to 6 months. But if they get launched in higher orbits, then we sit with these things cluttering up the space in the amateur frequencies, which is not a good idea. But Lyndon has been working in that area, so let's ask him to come and deliver his keynote address. Lyndon Petzer. I guess I need to put your...
Thanks very much for the introduction, Hans, and good morning to all of you. It's really a privilege and an honor for me to be here. I've missed the last couple of symposia due to work commitments, but it's always been a very interesting experience for me to be here, and I trust that we can have a good chat after the session, after the presentation, or I'll be around here until at least after lunch today. So if you do have any questions on this, I'd be happy to try and answer them. As Hans has said, I've got more than over 30 years experience in the spectrum management field. Currently the Chief Director at DTBS, soon to be the ex-Chief Director, as I will be taking a change in career as from the 1st of April, and I trust that is not going to influence what happens going forward. Having said that, before we get into the crux of the speech on the current activities in the ITU, I thought it may be useful just to have a brief overview of what the ITU itself is. The ITU is the UN specialized agency responsible for ICTs. It is situated in Geneva in Switzerland. This is the current headquarters building. They are busy with a project to have new buildings built. Some of the buildings date back to the 1960s and are no longer compliant with Swiss law, so they need to be upgraded. Now, I think the important thing is that decisions in the ITU, because it's a UN agency, are made by the member states, and it's not some bureaucratic body in Switzerland that decides this is how things need to be regulated. There are certain conference structures, which this is essentially the structure of the ITU. You have the plenipotentiary conference, which meets once every 4 years. That is the decision-making body of the ITU, and there are all member states participate in that. At the plenipotentiary conference, a council is elected to deal with management issues in the period between plenipotentiary conferences. South Africa has been a member of the ITU Council from 1992 up until about 2010. We then lost our seat, but at the plenipotentiary conference last year, we regained our seat on the council. Then there are also conferences on, and we'll come to those, on various aspects. Now, the ITU consists of 3 sectors. You've got the radio communication sector, which deals with all radio communication matters. You've got the standardization sector, and you've got the development sector, which deals with assistance to developing countries. Within the radio communication sector, you have the Radio Regulations Board, which interprets the ITU radio regulations. You have an advisory council, and you have study groups, and then that is supported by the secretariat of the sectors, and that repeats across all three sectors. Now, within the ITU study groups, and this is where we'll be focused today, much of the work that is done in these study groups. And currently there are the 6 study groups there. Study Group 1, Spectrum Management, Radio Wave Propagation, Satellite Services, Terrestrial Services, Broadcasting, and Science Services. There is no Study Group 2 due to a reorganization of the study group some years ago, and for some reason they just they kept the original numbering and did away with Study Group 2. Now, within the study groups, they made up of working parties, and this is really where much of the work happens. The study groups and the working parties consist of representatives of both government and industry, working together to define the frameworks that are going to ensure optimum work in the sector. Working Party 5A deals with amateur and amateur satellite issues. Now, it may be a little bit of an anomaly that amateur satellite issues are dealt with in a terrestrial working group, but as I say, that is essentially how the work has been organized. Now, a key objective of 5A is to facilitate equitable access to spectrum by the land mobile service, which is part of its mandate, the amateur service, and to exploit the benefits that can be achieved through implementing radio solutions to various needs. Now, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the handbook on amateur and amateur satellite services. This was last updated in 2014, and should you require a copy, it can be downloaded from that link up. Sorry, I'll get this pointer right sometime. From that link, free of charge. I do refer to some other ITU links later on. I understand from Hans that this presentation will be made available so you can access these links going forward. Now, I think as you're all aware that the amateur service provides an opportunity currently to around 3 million amateurs worldwide to use radio communications for personal applications. And throughout the years, at each World Radio Conference, which happens once every 4 years, there's always been an item pertaining to the amateur service. This year, the issue on the conference agenda is looking at an allocation in the frequency band 50 to 54 megs in Region 1, which is Europe and Africa, to the amateur service. For some reason or other, the amateur agenda items are always tend to be controversial at these World Radio Conferences. There are certain countries and certain groups of countries that seem to have an issue with the amateur service, and I find this quite unfortunate because I believe that amateurs do very good work. More than 40 amateur constructed low Earth orbit satellites that are operating. And this is really where we want to talk today. Hans touched on some of the issues earlier about every CubeSat operating in the amateur services, and this is something that we are trying to get away from. I think, as you know, the genesis of small satellites was in the amateur service, but today they're being used for a wide range of applications, including remote sensing, space, weather, astronomy, communications, technology demonstrators, and so on. And there are even some commercial applications. And I see on the program that there's a talk scheduled this afternoon by someone on ZAQ2. And I think that's going to be very interesting. You're all aware that was launched in December last year, satellite built by CPUT. It's a 3U unit, and they are busy with oceans monitoring on behalf of the Department of Science and Technology. And as I say, the problem is that every satellite that goes up as a CubeSat is classified as an amateur satellite, and this is something that in this paper that Hans referred to that I've been working on, we are trying to correct. Now, the services typically used: amateur satellite, space research, telecommand, Earth exploration, space tracking, MEDSAT, space telemetry, ISS, space operations. None of these, with the exception of that one, none of these are amateur services. So why are they using amateur frequencies? Now, the ITU has issued 2 reports pertaining to small satellites. Report 2312 deals with characteristics, definition, and spectrum requirements of nanosatellites and picosatellites. This report was issued in 2014. Again, it is available for download free of charge. Then you've got a second report that the ITU did on current practices and procedures for notifying. Oops, we have a problem. Okay, just trying to figure out where the power is. On current practice and procedures for notifying space networks applicable to nano and picosatellites. This was issued in 2015, and again, there you have the link for those reports should you want to look at them. They are available free of charge. Now, report 2312 was issued in response to a question that was raised within the study groups as to what are the characteristics of nano and picosatellites and systems in terms of the data rates, the transmission times, and the bandwidths, and then what are their spectrum requirements and under which radio communication services should they operate. One of the challenges is that there's no universally accepted definition of a small satellite, a nanosatellite, a picosatellite. Speak in different forums, you get different views. So in compiling this report, these were the definitions that they used. A nanosatellite, typically 10 to 100 kilograms, picosatellite 1 to 10 kilograms, and so on, the dimensions. The development time, which is very important, we'll come to that later. The orbits and the mission durations, again, a very important parameter, which we will see a little bit later. And as I say, that is a table that comes out of report 2312, so you can have a look at that at your leisure. The conclusions of report 2312 is that satellites have provided unprecedented access to space, particularly for developing countries, and we know as South Africa, we are one of the countries where we've got involved in this field, and in fact, in going future, we will do more. The standardization of the aspects allows for flexibility for their deployment as secondary payloads, because all of these satellites are deployed as secondary payloads, and this sometimes does result in delays in the launch. And I mean, the report also looked at the CubeSat spec that was developed by the California Polytechnic University and Stanford University, again, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, particularly with the work that you have been doing around Pletzkos and so on. Now, while these satellites are most often recognized by their small physical size, there are issues that distinguish them from traditional satellites, and this again particularly comes back to this issue of the development time and the mission duration. The ITU coordination process can take up to 8 years, which is crazy for a satellite which you're developing in a year and which has a 3-year lifetime. But as I say, again, we will touch on that a little bit later. So, based on the conclusions of this report, South Africa started looking at what could we do to simplify the ITU radio regulation for the coordination and notification of these satellites, and we'll get to that in a minute. Report 2348 deals with an overview of the current practice for filing, notifying and deploying these satellites and the challenges that exist in the coordination. And one of the problems that was identified is that often with these small satellites, the orbital parameters only become known quite late in the development of the satellite. Again, you're launching as a secondary payload, so you're reliant on your launch provider regarding the orbital parameters. And that makes the early notification and coordination of these satellites problematic. But even when these parameters are known, the speed at which these satellites are developed and deployed can mean that you're deploying your satellite before you've gone through the necessary regulatory procedures. And that creates a problem. Because the minimum time that the ITU needs for filing is 8 months. And sometimes in practice it's a lot more. Now, in theory, a satellite could be designed, built, and put into service in a year. If you've got to go through an 8-month regulatory process, it's just not feasible. So, based on these reports and the involvement of South Africa in the small satellite field, we felt that we need to have a better procedure. And the existing provisions in the radio regulations don't take account of the short development cycle. If you look at the whole process for coordination of satellites, it can take up to 7 years, which just isn't feasible. So what we are saying is that the successful and timely development and operation of these requires regulatory procedures that takes into account the nature of these satellites and the deployment and their timing. Now, we then put together a proposal for what we called a regulatory regime for non-GSO satellites with short duration missions. And we used this long title because of the difficulties of defining a small satellite and a CubeSat and a nanosatellite. So we said, okay, these are non-GSO satellites, they have short duration missions, this is what we're going to call them. And what has happened is, this was taken to Working Party 4A, which deals with efficient spectrum usage in satellites. Working Party 4A meets twice a year, and we must have submitted 4 to 6 papers during the study cycle at these various Working Party meetings. And after much debate and negotiation, The proposal was accepted as a work item in the working party, and text was developed that will be considered at the forthcoming IT World Radio Communication Conference. And that happens in Egypt in November, December this year. There was a lot of opposition to this paper from certain countries in the developed world, where they felt this was not necessary, but at the same time there was a lot of support from industry for this particular. Now, the existing provisions in the ITU radio regulations, as I've said, for the notification of satellites don't take account of the short development lifespan, and therefore we decided that we need to have this. And there's a draft new resolution that will be considered by the conference together with regulatory regime, where we're looking to accelerate the process for the submission of these. Very importantly, non-GSO satellites using spectrum allocated to the amateur service shall operate in accordance with the definition of the amateur service. So if you are going to notify the satellite as an amateur satellite, it's got to be an amateur satellite. If it's going to be Earth observation, you registered and you design it to operate on frequencies that are allocated to the Earth observation service. Something else that people have tried is to say we're registering as an experimental satellite. The international regulations make no provision for experimental satellites. There's provision for what they call an experimental station, but that is a terrestrial station. There's no such animal as an experimental satellite station. What we have proposed is that the total number of satellites in a system should not exceed 10 satellites. There's been some debate around that number. It hasn't been agreed, and that number will be agreed by the conference. And then the maximum period of validity is 3 years. So those are really the core issues in this resolution, and hopefully there will be some support for this. Another important issue that's been considered in ITU is TT&C for small satellites, and that TT&C must be within the service in which the space station is operating. Again, non-amateur satellites have been using TT&C frequencies in the amateur bands, and Working Party 7B, which is actually a space science working party, has been working on the TT&C requirements for, again, they've picked up the terminology that we've used of non-GSO satellites with short duration missions. Now, the studies that have showed that the amount of spectrum for non-GSO short duration mission satellites is less than a meg for the uplink, and somewhere between 0.5 meg and 2.5 meg for the downlink. And those are the frequencies that were under consideration for these TT&C frequencies. The studies have shown that sharing with existing services is not feasible in 150.05 to 153 because of the radio astronomy. There's land mobile stations that cause problems, radio location systems for space surveillance, METSAT, data collection, and radio sondes. So those are sub-bands within these identified bands. what has happened is there was no consensus on what allocation should be made to TT&C. So the study group has come up with 3 methods which will be considered again by the conference. The first one is that there should be no allocation to TT&C, which to my mind personally does not make sense. You can't wish these satellites away. They are going to be there. You can't say, well, we're going to launch these satellites and there's no TT&C for them. There's a second method which looks at an Earth to space allocation there, an Earth to space allocation there, and then there's a third method where you use the existing space operations service in the band for the downlink and 148 to 149 for the uplink. The big problem with this method is there's no downlink allocation made. You've got uplink allocations and no downlink, which again doesn't make sense. Thank you very much. That's my story. If there are questions, I'll be happy to take them now if time permits. Otherwise, as I say, I will be around here until after lunch. Thank you.
I'm sure there will be some questions. James.
Thanks, Hans. Morning, I'm James, 6 November Sierra. Well, Lyndon, you were mentioning about this new regulation you want to put through, or you're going to put through. Talking about an amateur satellite and an Earth exploration. What prevent people sharing satellites or you guys finding amateur bands? What about when an amateur service piggybacks on another nano satellite, like a multi-use? What will be called then, or how do you put around that kind of situation?
What would probably happen is the satellite would operate in different bands. So the amateur, what would be on the amateurs, they would use the amateur bands. If it's going to be Earth observation, there'd be a different radio on there that's operating in the Earth observation allocations.
It's a case of
With ZA Tube 2.
Yeah, and with the Oscar 100, the geostationary satellite, it's got an amateur transponder and it has TV transponders. And there are a couple of other CubeSats that have similar arrangements. Any questions? Leon, kan jy my sien?
Well, okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Leon Lessing, 36 LMG. I'm also involved with Hamlet, and the 403 to 405 meg for uplinking Earth to satellite, will that not start interfering with your 406 megahertz emergency location transmissions? Because those transmitters are notoriously very, very low power. And if you have high power 4344 transmissions, you might screw with a 406 meg ELT system.
Thanks. I haven't been intimately involved in those studies. I can check that out for you and let you know. But as I say, based on the work that was done in the study groups, I'm pretty sure they would have looked at it.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Because, as I say, within these working parties, you have a wide range of people participating, and I'm very sure that someone, if there was an issue, somebody would have raised that.
Last question. Sorry, I can't see you. There's too much bright light from. Go.
Eddie, Z6 Lyndon, seeing that you've got a seat on the Space Council of South Africa, could you tell us a little about the registration of the satellites? I've noted the process, but could you just tell us about the law there?
Yeah, Henny, that's a whole subject on its own. As I indicated, the ITU is the UN agency responsible for ICTs. They deal with the technical aspects. But space regulation within the United Nations is dealt with under 5 international treaties. The most important of those being the Space Treaty on the Use of Outer Space. Now, these treaties date back to the 1960s and the 1970s. There is also what is one of the treaties is the Registration Convention. And the Registration Convention requires that a country that launches any space object must notify this to the United Nations. And they have a register. It's also required that each UN member state has its own national register. The ITU also requires notification of and registration of objects. So you have a two-pronged registration process. There is a certain degree of overlap, although the ITU process is more technically based, whereas the UN process in the Registration Convention is more administrative. Now, what has happened is space regulation in South Africa is extremely complex. You've got the Department of Trade and Industry that is responsible for space policy. Then you've got the Department of Science and Technology, which is responsible for space strategy. Then you've got the Department of Communications, which is responsible for satellite communication. You've got the Space Agency, which is responsible for the implementation of strategy. And then you've got Foreign Affairs, DIRCO, which is responsible for liaison with the United Nations. So what happens is CPUT gets a license from the Department of Trade and Industry body, the South African Council for Space Affairs, which is the regulatory body in South Africa. SATSA, Council for Space Affairs, issues a license to CPUT, and this space object then needs to be registered with the United Nations. So the Space Council then writes to Foreign Affairs, to DIRCO, please register this. These are the characteristics. DIRCO then has to send this to the South African mission in Vienna, and the mission in Vienna then has to notify the United Nations. So it's in process, Henny, but it's a long bureaucratic administrative pain.
But all these processes are like the same thing. We dropped the Morse code, but the SEP document still says that you require Morse code in South Africa. And the point is that ICASA cannot go to SEP. ICASA has to now, first of all, put in a case to the Minister of Communication, or currently DTPS. Then they have to convince Foreign Affairs, and the same process again. So it's just not happening. And also our space regulations haven't been published.
No.
They're still not agreed. I mean, I've seen draft upon draft, and now the last draft was 2 years ago and it just died. You find out where it is and you hear nothing.
Yeah, there's an issue, and of course the forthcoming elections don't help either.
No. But what other interesting thing, because we're fast running out of time, actually we have run out of time, but during my tenure for many years, 20 or so years, as the IAU satellite coordinator, where I coordinated the frequencies for CubeSats, you know that 99% of those are never registered at the ITU. Never. England does, Switzerland does, the US sometimes, but mostly not. And the US also operates a thing where they say it's an experimental license. So, you know, all these regulations are very well, and if they would work and everybody stuck to them, I think it would be a lot better for us. But right now, nobody worries about it. They don't register because of the process, and maybe when that process is simplified, maybe it will happen.
Well, this is what we're hoping to achieve. And I mean, again, you know, the ITU is made up of the member states. If the member states don't want to comply with the regulations, there's nothing that can really be done. So one's hoping that by having a process that is not time consuming, that is reasonably simple that member states will comply. Just as Hans says, a number of people don't. One of the countries that was very opposed to this thing is France. And France are putting up, let's say, dozens of satellites. We won't say hundreds of satellites. And none of them are being registered. Now, because of these things being such short duration, and it's not being notified, if there's an interference problem, where do you go for redress? And this is really one of the big things. It's not a case of regulation for regulation's sake. It's a case of you need to know there is something up there. It's operating on these frequencies. If there's a problem, this is where I can go to try and resolve the problem.
But you also get that other situation, Iran. You register an amateur satellite, and they are the first ones to object. So you ask for a satellite on 145/800 in the amateur service, immediately they will object to it and say it may interfere with their communication, so therefore they cannot agree to it. And I mean, it's utter nonsense, but they seem to have a standard letter that must have been radioed off like 500 times in their days, and they just send it out automatically. I mean, all South African satellites had that complaint from Iran to say, no, you can't launch them because they will interfere.
No, there are countries that do that as a matter of course.
Yeah. So that also makes a bit of a joke. So if it's very pressing, last one.
Quick question, I don't know whether it's a short answer, but the ITU, the International Amateur Radio Union, do they talk together or they obviously say?
No,
They talk I would almost say James can help me as well. At all the World Radio conferences that I've been to, there's been a representative from IARU there.
There's about 5 of this coming up.
And that, they have representatives from different world regions as well. Because, there's definitely coordination between them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Interesting. Okay. Right, we can ask our next chairman to come and take over from me to introduce the next speaker, and hopefully we can find his presentation. You can hold those and then I'll put that on Julius. You can.
Right, guys. Good morning. I'm Ray Weber, ZS6RSW. I'm chairing session 1. We've got 2 interesting papers. The first one is by Tom van den Baan, ZR6 Tango Golf. He's going to give a paper this